started. Just a slight thump in the air as it shot. The minor, but noticeable flash that came from the business end of the weapon let the audience know the fire part of the name. Firearm wasn't just based off of the method of acceleration. Each bullet fired from it was accompanied by a noticeable snap and flash that seemed to grow louder and brighter with each round. When the slide on the top of the pistol finally locked back, Mick quickly rendered the weapon safe and continued on to the next. Gun after gun. This pattern of increasing intensity continued. Occasionally, Sarah would step in for Mick to demonstrate particular weapons she had a fondness for. After being able to fire a few guns, she seemed to be lightening up and enjoying herself a bit more. When it came time for her to show off the sidearm she had been carrying, she wielded it like a trained professional. In fact, the manner with which she operated the weapon immediately gave a couple of the security officers present some pause. Before she demonstrated it, she pulled the sleek pistol from its holster, racked the slide back to chamber a round, then put the weapon back into the holster. Standing in front of the demonstration lane, she stepped into a ready position with her hand floating just above the holstered gun and her eyes staring straight through the holographic target downrange. As if on instinct, the exact second Mick let out a loud beep noise with his mouth, Sarah's hand dropped to the gun and drew straight on target. In less than a second, 3 round shell casings were tumbling through the air, and the display showed 2 hits to the center mass of the target and 1 to the head. "It's got the fun switch," Mick commented with a devious smile on his face, seemingly unfazed by the bright flashes and loud pop. Sarah shot him a quick glance, then let her face slip into a similar smile. With a subtle movement of her thumb, she flipped a switch on the rear of the slide and took up a more stable shooting position. Instead of rapidly pressing the trigger to fire the rounds one at a time, like she just had, Sarah simply held down the trigger. Before the first casing could hit the ground, the pistol had already fired the 17th shot, and its slide had locked back. There was a shocked silence as the system did the calculations required to display what the audience wished to see. All of the other firearms shown thus far could be considered relatively low-powered pistols. However, they all inflicted lethal, but reasonable, amounts of damage. This one was quite a bit more. Instead of a singular projectile impacting a target, this burst acted more like a wall of metal and eviscerated the target. Though not every round struck true, the many that did would have literally torn most beings apart with their combined force. That is a standard M213 10mm personal defense pistol used by pretty much everybody in the Sol system, Mick announced to the audience. The guy that designed it published all the details online under a Creative Commons license, and now everyone makes, The idea of freely available weapon designs was somewhat shocking to the audience, but none questioned it. There are a few different loads it's optimized for, but that was a 10 projectile, leaving the barrel at around 700 mess. Everything going forwards is just going to get bigger and louder. That's your warning. He ended with a wink. Are ya really gonna run through that whole pile you brought? Half of them are just the same gun in different configurations, Sarah retorted with a hint of laughter in her voice. Ugh, Mick groaned. Fine, what order should I go in? I'll just run through them real fast and cover the basic types. Sarah stroked her chin with one hand while the other rested on her hip, as if to sell that she actually had to think about this. SMG, shotgun, rifle. Then you can show off those big toys you brought. but I'm shooting the shotgun. She quickly added the last part, while sauntering over towards the table. PDS are really just fancy pistols, and meant to be small enough to be concealed and held in one hand, Mick explained to the audience while following Sarah. SMGs, or submachine guns, tend to be a bit bigger, meant to be used with two hands, and can serve as a primary weapon in certain combat roles. Reaching the table, Sarah was already looking at the few different shotgun and ammo options to pick what she wanted to use. Though she would likely take a moment to make her choice, Mick immediately saw what he considered to be a nearly perfect example. What he wanted to demonstrate. The small, somewhat boxy, and an elegantly designed weapon was incredibly easy to produce, yet it served its purpose well, as Mick checked the tightness on the suppressor mounted to the end of the barrel. He began his short walk back to the firing line. Though Tens didn't mind the past 10 minutes of walking forth showing off weapons, he could tell Axika and the other Quiztar in the audience were enjoying themselves. Over his years in this crew, he had learned that these kinds of demonstrations were a form of entertainment for many of the combat-inclined Quiztar. In fact, it seemed everyone in attendance was at least pretending to enjoy themselves, if not showing genuine excitement at opportunity to try these new type of weapons. This is a kind of old design, but they made like 30 million of them, so there's a bunch still in circulation, Mick explained to the group as he approached the wide-open lane. It's called a Mech 11B2 and it's based on a damn near ancient gun called a Mass 11. This one is chambered in a smaller 5.7mm round. But the thing is spicy fast at about 1.3 s, turning to face down range and stepping into a far more secure stance than one would expect. For such a small weapon, Mick leaned forward slightly. No balls of fire came from the end this time, and the volume of the sound was relatively muted compared to a few others. However, it didn't sound so much like a weapon, but rather a deeply resonating, high-frequency sound. The noise was more akin to a drum roll, being played by multiple people as fast as they could. Mick was physically pushed back by the force, and all 30 casings had been ejected before the first had hit the ground. Pulling out the now empty magazine, he turned half back towards the audience while keeping the gun facing downrange. Without the limiters active, this thing does something like 30 rounds a second. It's just unnecessary. Mick half laughed to himself at the joke that didn't quite stick. To his audience, a personal level weapon with those capabilities wasn't unheard of, but generally considered a waste of resources to produce due to ammo expenditures. But we have a few settings that'll drop it half to 900 rounds per minute. Then 600, then single shot if you want it. Mick slapped in a new magazine to replace the empty one, flipped a switch just above his thumb, and readied himself back into his firing stance. This short burst, though much more controlled, still spewed a fair amount of casing in an incredibly short amount of time. Again, with a flick of his thumb moving the lever further, he placed it on the lowest automatic rate of fire setting and quickly spent the rest of the ammunition. Even with the short explanation between magazine changes, this was the fastest demonstration of any weapon so far. Ensuring the safety of the weapon like he had with all others before, Mick took a step away from Lane to give the eager Sarah her room. All right, this one is really loud since Sarah didn't grab one with a can on it. Mick chided towards Sarah as she smirked and held her weapon of choice. This is a Remington Model 2090, and it's the gun my dad taught me to shoot with. Sarah retorted with a slight tone of pride in her voice. But the one we had back home was a 20 gauge, not this military 10 gauge. And it didn't have all these bells and whistles, she commented while looking at the holographic sight projector, attached magazine and feed system toggle. As Tens took a couple more step backs and made an obvious act of double-checking his ear protection, the majority of the audience took the cue and did the same. With Sarah now in her ready position, she glanced over towards the range technicians and gave them a slight nod. Turning back, she was greeted by a target at 5M, a moving target at 10M, and a larger one at 20. As if racing against an imaginary clock, she addressed all three of the targets with a spray of shot and pump of the action. The sound and fire which erupted from the end of the weapon were enough to make some of the audience take a half step back. However, it was the sickening noise of smooth metal sliding against smooth metal from the pump action that made their spines tingle. Looking back towards the technicians who had been visibly taken aback by that display, Sarah nodded her head again, as if suddenly remembering they were supposed to be cycling the next set of targets. The technicians scrambled on their tablet for a moment. When they glanced back at Sarah and gave her a nod of confirmation, her smirk got just a bit wider as she turned back to the new targets. Before engaging them, Sarah flicked a switch to activate the self-loading function. Each target that popped up was immediately covered in shot or struck by one of the other projectile types Sarah had loaded. If they had been real targets instead of holograms, they would have all been a chunky mist. All. Except for the last round, which instead of erupting as flash, followed by projectiles. But the spattering of projectiles were also on fire. As the cloud of burning shards tore through the hologram, the smell of burning magnesium and carbon filled the air. Did you really put a dragon's breath round in there? It was Mick's turn to chide Sarah for something. Grand finale, Sarah half-joked, as she made the weapon safe and moved to return it to the table. That round's more for... Mick was struggling to find the right words to explain why humanity had designed and produced a firearm that literally shot fire. Entertainment? A voice spoke up from the audience. Though Mick could not tell which of the quiztar had said that, Tens was simply glad Akshika was having fun with this. Yes, Mick confirmed. But we also have far more practical weapons. Like this one. Mick held out the weapon for the audience to see better. The rifle he was holding was in a bullpup configuration, had an integrated suppressor built into the barrel, and looked to be nearly perfectly balanced for the ergonomics of its user. Though it was obvious to Mick that no one in the room knew what he was holding, he still held it out for a moment for people to see if they chose to. This weapon did not necessarily appear to be the pinnacle of design, even to the standards of humans in the Sol system. But practical military firearms rarely are. This is a ZCR-29, and this is one of the most common rifles a person can find in Sol system now. Mick had to fight the urge to go on a long rant discussing the history and specific developments of this weapon system. Instead, he chose to save it for others to find on their own. It's completely modular to the point where you could make it look like a totally different gun within a couple minutes. I'm not joking. There are 7 different versions of this on that table. Continuing on with the demonstration, this gun wasn't really all that much different from the SMG. Just bigger, louder, and more refined. Where the SMG and shotgun had been relatively crude implements, this rifle was far more sophisticated. switching from single shot to burst fire, and then to full automatic. The weapon displayed both precision and power. However, in reality, it really wasn't all that different from the previous ones. They were all accelerated through chemical combustion. As Mick moved on to the belt-fed light machine gun and the long-range precision rifle, both were quite impressive in their own rights and drew their own respective attention. Where the assault rifle had struck a balance between volume of fire and accuracy, the next two demonstrations showed the extremes of each separately. By the end of it, with barrels still smoking and the room filled with the faint acrid smell of gunpowder, the weapons of the Sol system had impressed everyone in the audience in some way or another. With the demonstration finally wrapping up and the various groups split off from the audience to personally inspect the table guns. Though the range technicians weren't particularly well versed in the rules and safety regulations of the new human weapons, they and the audience were all well-trained military personnel. Soon many of the smaller, closed-off firing lanes were occupied by the smaller groups. Though only the Questar naturally took to the ergonomics of the human weapons. Even they found the weapons to be somewhat awkward due to difference in hand and arm proportions. Sarah and Mick had stepped off to the side of the room to both make themselves easily available if there were questions, and to have a modicum of privacy if there were none at that moment. Just before the two could start any sort of real conversation, they were approached by a rather large reptilian walking on 6 of its 8 limbs, who seemed to have a relatively small mammal riding on its back. As the pair stopped at a respectful distance from the 2 humans, Mick couldn't help but let a slight hint of confusion slip through his expression. Sarah, on the other hand, was having an internal battle between the cuteness of the mammal and the scariness of the reptile. "Greetings, my friends." The large reptile bowed slightly before speaking in an open, hissing voice, which allowed its sandpaper-like teeth to become visible. "I am called Reichlar, and my close friend is Longswoop. In Cowrie." I would use his name in his own language, but my physiology prevents me from properly doing so. The mammal, who had been shyly hiding behind the reptile's colossal frilled neck, peeked its head out just far enough to let out a series of chirps and squeaks, which translated into its name. "And we both wanted to say how much we appreciated your demonstration. It's a pleasure to meet both of you, and thank you," Mick replied in the most pleasant voice he could muster. Sarah, meanwhile, was still speechless, but had moved past the ominous reptile to focus solely on the mammal's cuteness. "How can we help you?" Mike asked. "Well, while I am not much for the recreational use of weapons, my friend here is." The reptile spoke while seemingly trying to encourage his friend to do so. With the mammal not having found his courage just yet, the reptile continued. "The first weapon you demonstrated, the 22, I believe it was called, would be something he would be able to use. However, incompatible morphology." Mick finished the sentence in a polite manner. "Yes, I believe my frame is too small to safely use that shape of a firearm." The small mammal had finally found the courage to speak in its squirrel-like voice. "However, I should be more than capable of withstanding the forces of using it if it were an appropriate size." Longswoop clarified. "Of course," Mick said without a moment's hesitation, and to the delight of the mammal before clarifying, "but not at this exact second. I can just scale down and tweak a few existing designs. but I'll need some data on size and proportions.